Awesome. Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right. I think at this point, if I guess, is it already recording then?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we can kick it off.
Thank you, Caitlin. And thanks everyone for being here. This is our second subcommittee meeting of the Community Focus Group Subcommittee of the Affordable Housing Production Task Force. And I'm officially calling us to order. I don't know if I have to do that or not, but at 1:14 p.m. Yay. Okay, we made it. Wonderful. So welcome everyone. My name is Rachel Stucker. I'm the Director of Housing Alliance Delaware and also the chair of this subcommittee. Excited to continue talking with you all about recommendations for how we can best serve vulnerable populations today. Before we do that, we're going to do before we get into it, we're going to do roll call attendance and meeting minutes. So let's start with attendance. Do I do that?
I could do that. Okay. So I'm just going to go down my list. So Rachel Stucker
Here.
Lillian Harrison.
Here.
Sheila Grant.
Here.
Ed Gutzeit. Absent. Okay. Portia Harvey.
Here.
Nick Beard. Absent, but she may be joining later. Karen Records is absent. Patrice Gibbs is absent, and Sarah Ryan.
Here.
Okay, so we do have a quorum. We have 5 members out of 9. So
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Move on to the second agenda item, approving the meeting minutes from our meeting on October 24th. Or in October of 2024. I would accept a motion from anyone to approve the meeting minutes.
I make the motion.
Oh,
I'll second.
wait, who made the motion? Is that you, Lillian? Okay, Lillian made the motion, Sarah Ryan second. Any discussion?
No, I am.
Okay, all in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
I
Meeting minute approval. Are you participating in that vote? I know you just walked in the door. I know she's here.
Do you need it for the quorum?
No, we have.
no, we have a quorum.
So, okay, any objections? Any abstentions? So all in favor, great.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, so today we have a good chunk of time here. We have a lot of time. And so we want to spend as much of that time as possible, pretty much the rest of the time today, talking about the potential recommendations that folks shared in the Google Drive that was created as a result of last meeting. So just to remind everyone what happened last time, we decided to create a shared document under kind of 3 categories, responding to 3 questions that really represent what the legislation assigns our committee to do, which is to review support services needed and barriers to access housing for populations represented on the subcommittee. I had created 3 questions that I think really get at that. Question 1, what recommendations can we make to ensure that these populations can access future housing production? Right, so the big task force, larger task force is charged with focusing on housing production. We're charged at looking at barriers to access. So what are some recommendations we can make to make sure the populations we're here to represent can access future housing production? The second question was, what recommendations can we make to ensure support services accompany that future production? Again, going back to our charge in the legislation around services needed. And third, similar, but what recommendations can we make to ensure that any new units can be affordable and accessible to these populations? And so I had asked folks, and a number of you did, so thank you so much, to go ahead and think about what recommendations we can make under each of those 3 questions that we would potentially want to discuss and then potentially bring to the larger task force at their next meeting in January or February. So thank you for those of you who were able to do that. What I wanted to do today was literally go through every recommendation that folks shared. And whoever made the recommendation, you will be asked to speak about it. Folks will have an opportunity to ask questions, we'll discuss it, get clarity. And based on the discussions that we have today, after today, what I envision my role will be, is to go through, what we discussed based on each of these recommendations and try to like firm things up, finalize things, like tweak the language, get more clarity, and bring back, based on our discussion, a set of potential recommendations for us to really make decisions about at our next meeting. So that's the process that I'd like to use today. And so we're gonna start with number one. And when we get to one of yours that you included, I'll call on you and ask you to describe and explain it. Everyone, anyone have questions about process or anything before we get started? Okay. Great. So barriers to access. What recommendations can we make to ensure populations can access future housing production? So I'll start because I guess mine's first. I had a recommendation that legislation should be passed that prevents eviction filings that do not result in evictions or orders of possession. And for lawyers in the room, I don't know if I'm using the right words. But basically, I know that currently when you file an eviction, that filing shows up, even if you ultimately, it's my understanding that those filings show up, even though you're not actually evicted, like you could have, right? So that should not show up at all on your,
This might be a silly question.
Yeah.
But if a landlord filed and didn't work, do we have any record that, I don't know, for example, the landlord tried to file in violation of VAWA or something?
probably not.
No, any file, so it's all civil record in Delaware is public record forever,
Okay.
right? So if you file a debt action, if you file landlord tenant action, you get too many parking tickets and it's a civil like vehicle issue, it all shows up in public record in perpetuity forever.
Oh, my red light?
Yeah, so just the filing of the case alone often triggers people to be denied from future housing opportunities. Because no one's digging to see who filed wrongly or who,
Okay.
you know, got the if the case was dismissed because it wasn't
Yeah.
all this.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
yes, so people could be filed against in violation of federal or local law. But it's still gonna show up on their
Yeah.
record, and so when they're seeking access to housing units, that's something that then landlords will see and consider them a potential risk. So my recommendation is that those should not show up in some way on anything. And then also eviction, even if you are evicted, those stay on for, I think, in perpetuity. I could be wrong about that, but that there should be some limit to how long that influences and impacts your ability to access housing in the future. Whether that's 1 year, 2 years, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. I just put 1 year there for fun because it felt right.
I think the federal guidance is 7 years.
The federal guidance, 7 years. That's a long time.
That civil legal issues should cycle off after 7 years.
Okay. That's a long time.
I would also note that there's no way in Delaware to shield any information on the civil, not on the family law side, but on the civil legal side, right? So there is not a mechanism to ask the court for the filings to go away or to be shielded from public view. So even if there is a case that involves things that you may not want to be public, like your name or your children's names or other things, that there's not a mechanism for shielding.
Is that normal? Like,
No.
is that
No,
normal
in other
across states?
states, there's usually a way to, I mean, we can do research, but other states have ways where you can ask the court to like make public record, non-public record, right? To shield it from public view. It still exists.
Right.
Someone who asked for records at the courthouse might be able to get it, but from the website.
Yeah, John Smith off the street.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So I don't know if this makes sense or is doable. That's helpful information. Maybe it's a matter of having it show up differently, but I don't know, thoughts about this? Sarah, I just want to clarify what you're saying before actually I say thoughts about this and move on. Are you saying this is not even feasible or possible?
No, I'm saying other states do it,
Oh, okay.
and the federal government.
I'm saying in Delaware, there's not even a way, and therefore, okay, I misunderstood like the point you were trying to make.
Yeah, so
Okay.
legislation should be passed, I think. Yeah.
That would be the way.
That would be-
Okay,
okay, yeah.
okay.
And I can type notes if people want me to add anything or not, just let me know.
If someone could take notes, that would be super helpful. I
And
don't,
Michelle's doing like, you know, notes for meeting
Minute.
minutes, but I mean, for the purposes
Oh.
of like making clarifications.
Gotcha.
in Google Doc.
yes,
I can do that.
can you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Would you like me to add something?
Yeah, just like points of discussion that come up that you think are useful to remember.
Okay, so other
Um,
states
Have mechanisms for civil records to be
to
hidden or something like that.
shield
There you go.
public from civil records. I also wanted to capture Nick's point about, you know, a landlord could file in
Mhm.
violation of a federal law and,
Let's still show up.
yeah, okay, so.
Feels like if we want to have equity, if landlords are able to search tenants, shouldn't tenants be able to find out what landlords have done?
Well, they can.
Yeah.
Go on Court Connect and you can search anybody in your entire life to see what their debt actions are, whether they filed cases.
Yeah, we should make it easier for them.
I mean, there is certainly data out there about landlords that are high filers.
Okay. Cool.
Do other folks, I know, especially folks who, I know participating virtually in discussion can feel challenging sometimes, so virtual, folks on the virtual side of things, thoughts?
I think that this is a great point, Rachel. One of the things that's coming to mind is filings that have since been satisfied. For example, clients may have been displaced from their home. It may have resulted in possession, but later on they were able to pay that balance down. And what we would consider as a recommendation for those, should, after it's satisfied, should they automatically fall into the group that it doesn't show up on the background at all because it has since been rectified, or but that's the only concern or question that comes to mind.
I mean,
Feel free.
I think it's all in the timing, right? So I would argue that if the eviction was withdrawn or dismissed, it should immediately be removed from record. And if it was a judgment, there's some period of time that it stays and then it disappears. So I like your 1 year, but I think maybe like there's probably.
Yeah, I was like, I just made that up.
Okay,
There's probably like.
I got the first part. If the filing was withdrawn or dismissed, it should be immediately removed. What was the next thing? you
Well,
said?
so we're talking about judgments,
Okay.
right? So I think a judgment, I mean, ideally, I'd love them to be removed immediately, but I mean, I think if we're looking for legislation, it probably there's some period of time that a judgment stays and then is taken off, right?
Okay, so a time period for cases not withdrawn or dismissed.
Correct.
Rude. Lillian, Lillian and Sheila, do you have any, is this a recommendation that you think would be important and helpful for the populations we're talking about? Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on this one?
No, I'm agreeing with all the points, and I'm glad that Portia said it because I was thinking that too. I recently had someone that had satisfied a judgment, and we were dealing satisfied an issue, and it's still showing up. So we're facing the challenges of trying to come up with documentation to show that it was satisfied and all that kind of thing. But it is a barrier. So no, I agree that I like this recommendation, and hopefully that it's something that they will take very seriously because it's probably one of the larger barriers.
Anyone else? Thoughts before we move on to the next recommendation?
I'll just say, I think most of you are working more closely with this issue, and I know Rachel works very closely with it, so it's not something I have a lot of knowledge about, but it sounds very reasonable to me, and I think it's a good thing to include.
All right, then thank you, Sheila, for, I always like to call on people, so thank you for responding to me calling on you. Then we're gonna move on to the next one. Sarah, can you talk about this one? This was your recommendation. The next one, housing authority screening.
So I'm focused specifically on housing authorities here. Although certainly I think I'm just gonna flag that the discussion could be to expand this recommendation to all landlords. But we know that housing authorities screening, and I mean, I guess we could include all federal housing subsidies like HUD and LIHTC housing. They do criminal background screenings, and they do not limit those screenings to recent serious criminal offenses. There's federal guidance that says that landlords should not consider anything other than recent serious criminal offenses, but it doesn't say they must not, right? And so it's kind of an area that where housing authorities or federal housing has some discretion, and we see in Delaware that these properties and housing authorities do deny people for things other than recent serious criminal offenses.
Quick question. What would you, an example of a recent criminal serious offense would be? Like what's recent and what would be considered serious? I'm not asking for the whole, like, just an example.
So the case law on this is interesting because it's kind of if it feels like it's recent and serious, it might be.
That's right.
So I would say, there are categories that I think everyone would agree are serious enough to ban people from some types of housing. A level 1 sex offense is often in that category. Manufacturing methamphetamine is often in that category. Like all of the things that are like kind of, if they look and smell like they're super serious, they probably are. But I think where we see the most issues are with offenses that are not recent or serious, like a child in the household, a child the age of 16 stole a vape pen from a local vape shop and got criminally charged for that. Is that something that should keep that household from accessing or maintaining housing, right? Like, I would argue that's not serious, even though it's recent. Or a person was charged with a first-degree sex offense in 1972. They are now deaf, blind, immobile, and have a live-in aid. Are they a threat to the community? Is that a recent conviction? Understanding that it would have to fall within the sex offender registry guidelines and all of that. Like if they're in a senior housing facility that's not in any way violating those guidelines, like should they be able to live there with that not recent serious offense?
And I can't, manufacturing meth comes from HUD, right?
Correct.
That's the only context I've ever heard that offense used.
Yeah.
So one.
That's very specific. It's dangerous.
Yeah, you can explode the building. Don't do
Could
it.
I share information, just
Yeah.
research as a staffer? So there's this study called Success in Housing, How Much Does Criminal Background Matter? And it was a project done in Minnesota. Basically, a bunch of nonprofit housing providers banded together and worked with the Wilder Research Institute to look at their tenant data, look at, criminal history, and to look at those folks' housing outcomes, whether they were positive, negative, or neutral, meaning there was no information at move out to indicate one way or the other. And I'm happy to share this with, the subcommittee after the meeting, but they found that 11 of the 15 criminal offense categories that they looked at have no significant effect on housing outcomes after controlling for other factors. So things like marijuana possession, minor drug offenses, alcohol-related offenses, public nuisance things, those types of offenses did not affect your housing outcome, meaning having that on your background doesn't mean you're gonna be a bad tenant and get evicted or violate your lease. They also found that to the extent that there is a relationship between criminal history and success, that relationship declines over time to the point where it's insignificant. Specifically, for misdemeanors, after 2 years, that's no longer going to impact your housing outcome. And for felonies, it was 5 years. So if you have a felony on your record and it's 6 years old, according to the study, it would not actually be an indicator of a negative housing outcome. So
Interesting.
I thought it was a really cool study. I came across it a couple of years ago. I actually wanted to be able to replicate it here in Delaware, but that costs money and you need willing landlords to share their tenant data, and that hasn't panned out. But just wanted to share that. Back to you, Rachel.
Interesting. Thank you, Caitlin. Thoughts from other members of the subcommittee about this issue recommendation?
Caitlin, can you cite that article under this recommendation?
Yes,
I think
I am
it's some good data
adding a
to
note
draw
right-
from.
And like I said, I can send a link to everybody.
Make it, I know I wrote it, but housing authority screening and termination? Or is that a separate thing?
Well, then, I mean, PHA's only controlled termination in public housing, right?
No, they terminate vouchers.
Oh, vouchers,
Yeah.
right? So like a landlord could terminate, but someone could keep their voucher. Right, I get what you're saying. Okay.
I think where with my population, it would be not doing this, it would be the afterwards, and what are the procedures of public housing authorities as to like, they putting you in the same place as someone who may, so I think it's the guidance afterwards where I would say there would be an interest for DV.
Yeah.
I feel like adding terminating is tricky.
Okay. I'll think of something else for terminating.
I mean, I don't know, do other folks have thoughts like?
Better you can,
Because I think,
Sarah, come on.
because I think, I mean, terminating is hard in terms of its impact on the community, like. I don't know, who gets to decide how much it impacts someone's, I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling about it, it just sounds tricky. Do other folks have feelings about adding termination? In that case, Sarah, can you talk about the returning citizens moving in with families? The PHAs did the thing.
I have info on that too.
Okay.
Sarah should go first.
Awesome. You can start with your info.
Oh, okay, great. So what Sarah's referring to is what we call FRP, or the Family Reentry Program.
That's what it's called.
It was originally designed and launched in 2019, so right before COVID. But it was basically an agreement among the public housing authorities here in Delaware and the Department of Correction that if a person is leaving incarceration and they have a close family member living in one of our public housing units, so not a voucher household, but an actual public housing unit that's owned either by DSHA, Wilmington Housing, Dover Housing, or Newark Housing Authority, we would allow that reentrant to live in that public housing unit as a guest on the lease for a period of 1 to 2 years. And for that time period, their income, if they calculated toward the household's rent, right? So they wouldn't be at risk of losing their public housing subsidy just because they have another adult in the household. The idea was after 1 or 2 years of being in the family reentry program, if the reentrant is successful, meaning they haven't been rearrested, everything's going well in the family home, they would actually have an opportunity to formally join the lease. And at that point, they would be expected, like their income would factor into the household's eligibility for the unit. Unfortunately, we've never had a successful applicant for family reentry program. I think one of the reasons is we had some applicants who they're coming out of incarceration and their loved one has a voucher, but they don't live in a public housing unit.
Right.
Well, our program is focusing on our public housing units because we, as the PHAs, are the landlord and we are agreeing to do this program. We wanted to be able to show success on our public housing side before asking our voucher landlords to also sort of participate in the
You can't
program.
force a landlord to like add someone to the lease if they don't want to, right?
No. And so, you know, we had a few folks that were interested in applying, but they weren't eligible, right? Because their family member has a voucher, they're not living in one of our units that we have control over. The other thing is obviously like COVID, right? That just totally, you know, a lot of things got put on the back burner. About a year ago, the 5 public housing authorities, DHSS and DOC all banded together, and with the help of Social Contract, which is a consulting firm, we redesigned the family reentry program, and we wanted to create an FRP coordinator position, somebody who would serve as a liaison between the reentrant and DOC and whichever public housing authority that loved one's family member lives at. And we just found out recently from Social Contract that the Department of Correction has been approved to use some ARPA money to pilot an FRP coordinator position, which is really great news. We are hoping that in 2025, we can relaunch and actually make this a thing and have successful applicants. But that's where we are today.
Was it limited in terms of, so that's exciting. Was it limited in terms of the number of people it could assist?
No, and that's sort of like a dark figure, right? Like we, as PHAs, don't necessarily know if our public housing clients have a loved one who's about to get out of DOC who might be eligible for the program.
So maybe it's like a relaunch. Maybe it's a recommendation around like implement this thing or
support it, or I know.
Also, did it have any stipulations as to the type of I'm saying the offense. So did it exclude any type of offender? Was it open to any offender that's reentering society, or were there exclusions?
That's a great question. So the 2 exclusions that we had to maintain are the ones that come from HUD, which is if you are subject to a lifetime sex offender registry requirement, then we can't take you. And if you've been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamines in a federally subsidized unit, we can't take you.
Subsidized unit.
I've literally never heard of this offense except in this context.
But so those are the only ones that are like absolute no-goes. We actually received technical assistance from the Vera Institute for Justice when we originally conceived of the FRP program. And I should mention that NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, has a successful family reentry program that's been going for like 10 plus years. But it took them several years to get off the ground.
So that like cross-system coordination that has to happen and.
Yeah, you need like, you know, probation and parole has to be knowledgeable about it. So there's a lot that goes into it, but to go back to your question, Lillian, the only 2 offenses that are absolute no-goes were those 2. I think otherwise we had a sort of matrix that we came up with to look at, again, the severity of the offense, the length of time. But those were the only 2 offenses that we would just, as soon as we see that, your application wouldn't move forward.
Thank you.
I mean, I would hope that even if it wasn't a level 1 sex offense, if they were convicted of a crime against their partner, we would maybe provide resources rather than just be like, sure.
You back in with that person.
Well, and that's a great point is, you know, the family member living in the public housing unit has to agree to this, right? Like, we're not just saying like, you know, oh, there's a reentrant and you're related, so we're going to stick this person with you. Like, the family has to consent.
Can they be an unmarried, like, can it be an unmarried couple?
I know we revisited the categories of what a close family member is, but I'm pretty sure domestic partners were considered close family members.
So again, I think it's that, this seems like a great program. It's all about what are our procedures? Do we refer them to, so all that seems like an after, before we figure out.
Does anyone have any, is anyone against this type of program relaunching and trying to get this underway? In Delaware? Okay, seeing head shaking. All right, for the sake of time, I want to make sure to move on to the next one. Sarah, Delaware should pass additional legislation, put more resources towards affirmatively furthering fair housing. I have some questions there, like what would that legislation do? And then you also have look at race disparity. What does look at mean? So part of what I'm trying to do in a lot of the questions I'm going to ask today is like frame these in terms of like the three things that the task force is looking at around. Is it a funding recommendation? Is it legislative? Is it regulatory? Like what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so we have passed source of income-ish now, which is wonderful. But I think that there are a few things that we could recommend around affirmatively furthering fair housing that might not even include legislation. I think one of them would be to fully fund DHCR.
That's what I thought you were gonna say. Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
So that's the Division of Human and Civil Rights.
Correct.
Sorry, I cut you off. Fully fund that. What do you mean by fully fund? Like,
I mean, they lack capacity to timely and adequately respond to all of the complaints related to fair housing.
do they have staff that's specific to fair housing?
No.
Okay. I mean, I don't know how they're structured at all, if they have staff specific to anything, but, okay. Okay.
There is only one DOJ that takes fair housing cases, along with many, many other cases. So this might also extend to fully funding that, but I don't know that.
Fully funding what? Sorry.
If a charge is made by DHCR and they are not able to resolve the case through conciliation, they send it to the DOJ, to the state's attorney's office, who then is supposed to litigate the case. And they don't have the capacity to timely in all cases that probably deserve it.
Okay, so this would be about increasing DHCR and DOJ capacity to respond to and enforce fair housing law. Okay.
Do you want me to add a line about DOJ capacity?
And then you said, look at race disparity. Are you recommending that there be a particular
So,
study
I don't want
or?
to skip over individuals with disabilities. So
Oh, sorry about that. Yep.
almost all of our fair housing actions are related to individuals with disabilities. So landlords often do not understand or do not adequately apply fair housing to individuals with disabilities. And often I don't think it's out of I think it's out of lack of understanding often, and not like there's a lot of paternalism, right? This apartment wouldn't be good for you because it has a stair in the front. So I'm not going to rent it to you. We see that with some frequently. So, and that's a nationwide, that's not just in Delaware, that individuals with disabilities face the most.
Is the recommendation similar to the increasing capacity? Like calling out the issue of people with disabilities specifically, but is it, when it comes to like whether it's a funding, regulatory, legislative fix, is it within that same like?
Correct.
Okay.
And then, so I think, like, I just wanted to call out also the racial disparity issue, right? So many households in Delaware that need access to affordable housing have Black female-headed households. We all know that. I didn't make a recommendation. But I do think that, this is something that we need to think about in a really critical way, especially related to home ownership, and access to those programs and supports.
Thank you. Does anyone else have questions or responses, opinions about this one, Sheila?
Yeah, I just wanted to drag the issue of aging into it and ask some of you who work more on the ground with people that are trying to find housing. Is there an issue? You brought up disabilities, people with disabilities steps. So, I think almost half of people over a certain age have disabilities of some type. So it really is an issue that AARP cares about. Do you find that age discrimination in addition to disabilities is a problem in housing?
So we do investigations based on age discrimination. However, most of the clients that we represent do live in housing designated for seniors. So it's usually less of an issue with age and more of an issue with the perceived capacity of the person. So either intellectual capacity or physical capacity that landlords are trying to make decisions based on those things, which I think would fall in both age and disability discrimination, but usually fall more squarely within disability, where the landlord is saying not you're old, but rather, we don't think you should live here anymore because you need an 8 hours a day, and we don't think that's a good plan. You should go to a nursing home.
Right. So as you're trying to find units for somebody who might be older or have disabilities, would you say there's a lack of age-friendly housing? I know we have whole, buildings that are designed for seniors, but are there enough of them? And do we have any lack of age-friendly housing?
Lillian, you unmuted. I would say yes.
I'm gonna yes, because I was gonna say, when you say age friendly, are we talking about, like, there's a difference between accessible housing and adaptable housing? Like, so we're dealing with that right now, like with the DDC and the State Rehab Council. So we're looking at, making people understand the difference between accessible housing and adaptable housing. And so with those that are aging in place, I'm not gonna say senior friendly or age friendly so much as just accessible, adaptable housing, period. With the understanding that there is a difference between those that have disabilities, different types of disabilities, from cognitive disabilities to physical disabilities, but also those that have special needs because they're transitioning and they need to age in place.
So,
Wonderful.
sorry,
So I would just ask, as we're making recommendations, that we might just add in some of what Lillian was talking about, that we don't just say disabilities, but maybe age as well, or adaptable housing as well, with a recommendation.
Yep, we'll think about, there are, well, you'll see the next one I'm about to ask Portia to talk about. There are some things in here about housing for seniors and accessibility. And so we can think about kind of where that fits. Thank you. For the sake of time, oh, go ahead.
No. Not to kind of go back to it, and I don't know what I want to say, so that's why I wasn't going to say anything. So I guess I just needed to understand more about the female head of household and what we might find as a disparity, because the thing was like access to programs and services. I feel like there's access to programs and services for everyone. Do we need more? We of course need more, but mainly it's from a ground up issue, like from a grassroots perspective. It's like the date and times that these programs and services are available, and then we're going to get into the talk about wage disparities, because that's really what's keeping some of these head of households out of affordable housing, is simply the wage disparities.
So I do want to move on to Portia's. Portia, you had something here, more senior. Okay, sorry, Ed, go ahead. Did you want to comment on this one?
Sure, couple things. One, many persons with abilities also need some sort of care. Maybe not around the clock, but at certainly a few times per week. And that's the other hurdle. There aren't enough caregivers. And you will find that many of the persons who are homeless who also have disabilities, it's because they can't get care.
Mhm. Yeah, and I remember that we talked about that a little bit at the last meeting too, that came up, the issue of care, and if you can't get care, then it can become impossible to maintain housing. I want to make sure, that's definitely something that's going to come up, I think, further down in some of the other recommendations that are here. So we don't want to lose it, and I'm not saying we don't talk about it, but I want to move on and make sure we get through the recommendations and bring that up, I think, under some of the ones that I said below, where that's going to be more relevant. Portia, can you talk briefly? So more senior housing is needed. A designated inventory of housing being produced as section 202. I think there's a lot in this one, and so I guess I kind of want you to unpack a little bit exactly what you're thinking the recommendation would be under this one.
Sure. I think many of the points that were just raised on the last recommendation kind of reflect what I was trying to identify here. Ed, you mentioned support. Section 202 housing does provide housing and support. So some of that extension of services that seniors may need to be able to like keep that quality of life would be provided under Section 202 housing. Also, an important point about the Section 202 housing is the income requirements in order to attain some of these housing. So at first glance, it says that the target earnings for this type of housing is 50% or below the area median income, and which we know are individuals on fixed income receiving Social Security income of some type of disability automatically would fall into that category. Whereas fair market housing, income disparity, it's not direct discrimination, but it is discrimination. People that are on fixed income automatically are not qualifying. So they're automatically a population that's not even being considered for fair market right now.
Okay. So are you seeing this as a recommendation, like, again, just trying to frame this, like so section 202, and I apologize, is that specifically for seniors? Or just people with disabilities?
Seniors.
Oh,
My research has pulled
Like, I
seniors.
feel like I never hear about section 202. I thought it was just seniors.
There are a lot of sections.
I know.
It's just seniors.
Okay.
There's not a whole lot of it.
Right. That's what
Which is, yeah, to Portia's point.
And
there's
my
not a whole lot
understanding,
of it.
Delaware, okay.
my understanding is this will be funding.
Right, and that would be federal funding that would have to come from HUD through to the PHAs in some manner. Okay, all right, we'll look into that. Okay, then other thoughts about this recommendation? It could be something like public housing authorities in Delaware should take advantage of, try to get more of these federal resources to the state to help.
One of those things where you politely direct them to investigate.
Right, yep. Okay.
I mean, so, not to be negative, I'm gonna try not to be negative. Given the current projections for what the federal government may or may not do in the next 4 years, I'm not sure that we should rely on section 202, perhaps encouraging our state to take up the mantle and specifically invest in or encourage developers to include units designated for individuals. I would hope 30% AMI or 30% AMI or below, or 50% is what Portia said. To like designate units in new LIHTC properties or other properties that may be able to be designated for elderly. But I'm just not convinced that the federal government's gonna give us.
I don't think there's gonna be
I
much.
just put state support needed to supplement federal programming.
Sure. Excellent. Well, and I think a lot of this, I mean, there
I'm just
are.
the scribe. I want it to be what you guys want it to be.
Yes, I think that sounds good. I think also some of the recommendations below are gonna be similar around making sure there's set asides of funding for supportive housing.
Yeah.
For lowest income folks, for people with disabilities, and so a lot of that, I think, is a directly relates when it comes to like how you get to that outcome. Is state investment in that type of housing.
We can hold two thoughts in our head at once, which is
That's right.
that number one, if there is federal money on the table, we should take it. And at the same time, knowing that there might not always be federal money on the table to take, and wanting to make sure we continue to deliver an excellent level of service.
That's right. There you go. All right. I'm gonna move on to the next one. So this is about, this is a recommendation that Delaware should evaluate and potentially make reforms to the SRAP program. I could talk about this for a really long time. I don't want to. But I think that SRAP is the only state funded, as I think most people here know, state funded. It's basically a state funded housing choice voucher program that is supposed to come with support services for folks who would otherwise potentially be institutionalized. And there's SRAP vouchers, a certain number dedicated to certain DHSS departments. So like Children and Family Youth, Division of Substance Abuse, Mental Health, and people who are receiving services from those departments in DHSS are identified. The way it currently works is they're identified by their DHSS worker, and somehow that worker decides to, and there's no DHSS folks here, so I'm just trying to stand in for that, to refer them to DSHA for an SRAP voucher. I know from having worked in just the homeless assistance system in Delaware for quite a long time, that I literally could not count on one hand the number of people experiencing homelessness who have ever gotten access to an SRAP voucher. And so I think just thinking about how do we use, it's not saying that folks aren't getting access to it that need it, but like who's getting access? How is it being used? Are people getting the services they need to stabilize in the unit, to be good tenants, to live healthy lives? I know a lot of times folks will get SRAP vouchers and maybe not necessarily get support in identifying units. And since it's intended to target vulnerable populations, like how well is it meeting their needs? I think if we're gonna have a really, really important and awesome state resource like that, we should just make sure it's working really well to meet the needs of people who have most severe housing needs, which is my understanding is that was the intent. And so that's my recommendation. What do folks think?
I don't know if this goes here or farther down on the education of landlords. I also think that there needs to be some training for these state agencies to better not only understand what the SRAP voucher is, but what are going to be the broader needs. So I do know people primarily through DSCYF who have received it, and maybe an understanding of what the SRAP voucher does, what is some of the, I think that's really important because I'm
like
not
the
always.
staff working in the DHSS agencies?
Yes, I'm not sure they always completely understand.
Other health.
Yeah, I just want to say, I, for the last few years, I have spoken at OMB and JFC hearings in favor of increasing funding for SRAP. And I just pulled up a PDF about it. My understanding is that all the referrals come from DSHA, DHSS, children, youth, and families, youth, children, and families, and that it's really, they say that people that it's targeted to are people exiting a long-term care facility, a nursing home, as part of getting back into the community, individuals at risk of being admitted to a state-supported institution, so somebody that's going to get put into a nursing home if they don't have an alternative, young people exiting foster care, and families who have a barrier to reunification because they don't have housing. So I think it really is limited. The funding numbers look really small to me. I don't know if there's money that's still on the table for that at the end of the year, but I understood that it was a very limited program and you sort of had to be referred by one of these state agencies to get part of the program, to be part of it.
Yeah, that's correct. In terms of how folks access it, and that the state's allocation hasn't increased for a long time. And so maybe it's more of a clear recommendation about increasing the state's allocation as well to the program.
Rachel, you also have in your paragraph how the program operates. I think it's important to note that there may also be a need for increased capacity and maybe some meetings for feedback with DSHA to administer the program. We do see issues with termination of vouchers when they shouldn't be, or difficulty communicating, and I'm not sure that's something we should ignore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of this for me, was about, of course, like increasing the allocation. We want more money to pay for housing for people who can't afford housing, right? And who are at risk. But also, I just know it was created, it's done a lot of good, and there's an opportunity to think about how to make sure it's working as effectively as possible to meet people's needs, because I know it doesn't, just like any program, doesn't always do that.
Okay, quick, it's,
Am I allowed to?
Oh, yeah,
speak
yes,
here?
yes.
Just in reference to SRAP, and I believe Sheila made mention of this. So there is a specific allocation of funds, which is approximately $4 million. That amount has not changed. As prices for housing have increased, that means that the number of individuals that are able to be assisted with that $4 million has decreased. Approximately 100 vouchers. So it's pretty significant. That all being said, some of the DHSS partners have, for lack of a better word, bought additional vouchers with the additional funding that they have. So for example, DSAPID has vouchers that aren't directly through the money allocated.
That's interesting.
DSAM as well. That being said, there really needs to be an increase in allocation of funds, again, because of the rising cost of housing. You have to increase that HAP, housing assistance payment. As far as wraparound services and case management, in the core SRAP, we're not allowed to require case management. So someone can come into SRAP and then they can say, I no longer want to participate in case management. DSHA has no control over that. Again, that's through the DHSS partners. Also, as far as on the DSHA side, we received the referrals from the partners for SRAP. At this point in time, I believe the majority of the partners have available vouchers. But again, it's up to the partners to send over those referrals. The SHA can't do anything until we have them.
Yep. Okay. Great, thank you, that's helpful. Does anyone think that having more SRAP vouchers or trying to do something to make sure it's effectively meeting the needs of vulnerable populations is a bad idea? Before we move on to the next one. All right,
it's 2:07. We have to wrap up at 2:30.
Yep.
Real quick, I'm gonna see how many folks we have. We have 2 attendees. Okay, so we should be good with public comment.
Okay, thank you. All right, I want to move, Oh, okay. Trying to see if there's ones that might be quick that we can get people's feedback on. All right, let's just try. Okay, Portia. Can you talk about rent stabilization legislation?
So I know there's a couple of groups that are lobbying around getting rent stabilization bills passed. I know that it was introduced in the House last year, maybe. I'm not sure that it went anywhere. So if we wanted to, I guess, reintroduce that legislation in the next assembly, see if it could go anywhere. I guess that's what I'm trying to capture. Another suggestion would be maybe not, if we don't go that route of legislation, seeing what we can do to incentivize rent stabilization for the housing that is being created, as a result of this task force. And maybe that can provide the data and incentivize it to roll out largely for the state.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. Other folks have thoughts about rent stabilization legislation and I guess the reason I was like going, because I was trying to think about what incentivizing that for new units might mean. Because generally when I think about creating new affordable housing units, they are rent stabilized because they're subsidized in some way that requires them to be basically, but not all units created, which we need tons of units created, are going to be affordable, right? There's going to continue to be market rate units created. Anyway, thoughts about rent stabilization from other members of the committee?
Think you're going to get into it a little bit farther down with regards to that when you're talking. I think further down, I saw that you're going to be talking about developers and the creation kind of sort of, and that's where you're going to talk about the incentives really, because the cost of building affordable housing is unfortunately what is getting passed on to the end user. So we need the incentives. As a developer, I need the incentives to help me get it low, whether that's incentives for the development, the building of it, or the gap funding, so that even if I build it at one cost, when I go to either sell it or rent it, I'm not operating underwater, kind of sort of. So I think we get down into that farther on.
That's also what's getting discussed in some of the other subcommittees right now. So like our regulatory and permitting subcommittee has talked a lot about carrots versus sticks, right?
Yes.
Carrots, your incentives.
Yes.
It's also come up in, our construction subcommittee and the finance and development subcommittee, so.
Yeah, because you have like Sussex County, I think, has the grant, like one of the grants that the Sussex County uses on the consumer side of it, which provides some incentives for the consumer, for the end user who's going to either buy or well, buy, because it doesn't do rentals, but that incentive needs to be more. There are developers, who are willing to build affordable housing, but I can't do anything on the consumer side. And if what I'm buying, if what I'm building it with, if the funding I'm building it with has compliance tied to it, that I need to meet 60 or 80% or below the AMI, then on the consumer side, it just needs to be more assistance on the consumer side so that they can do that, because my building costs don't change. They're still high.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Lillian. And I think you're right. A lot of that is further down the document around the subsidies for households.
Mm-hmm.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip a lot, and I want to make sure Ed has an opportunity to speak. I know, Ed, you had shared some information with the committee about Medicaid asset limits and how that that impacts people who have Medicaid, their ability to either access or stabilize in housing. I wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to talk about that recommendation that you have today. Can you share with us a little bit about that and why you're bringing that forward? Ed, are you able to unmute and speak about that one?
I might be able to unmute him.
And not unmuting.
Oh, there you are. You're unmuted now.
One key problem that many people have is to update their money. And Delaware is not one of the handful of states that have increased the Medicaid asset limits. That would go a long way towards helping people who are on Medicaid have a have money. Delaware still has a $2,000 asset limit. There are a few states that have gone way up, but there are several that have 3, 4, 5, $6,000 asset limits. This would help keep
Tremendously.
people housed. It would help people get health care. What I don't know is what would the impact be on the state's finances? Where does that funding come from? I think one thing that hurts us here in some ways is we don't have a sales tax. But states that have sales taxes, it's obvious to the business community that if people have more cash, they will buy more. We're out of that. So I don't know the impact, but I think I did send that listing of states that have increased their asset limits. And what's interesting, in short, is many of them are what would be commonly called red or Republican states. It sort of goes counter to what you may think. So it's just interesting, but that is positively something that needs to be looked at. That would help keep people housed.
Thank you, Ed. I have a question for you. Is that cash assets or like if I have a car that I own that I don't have any payments on and it's worth $2,000?
I will need some help with that, but I think it's all assets.
That's
It's all
insane.
assets.
All
That's
assets.
insane.
It's all assets. I'm taking a certification now for SSA and it's all assets.
Wow, okay.
There's some
So you can't be
things
able
that
to
are
afford security deposit and first
not
month's-
counted.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Right.
my bad.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I think I cut you off in the middle of a sentence and I didn't mean to. I was just.
I'm not
surprised at how
sure.
low-
I'm not sure whether things like clothing counts
No.
against the ad. No, so there are some
Right. No,
basic
not clothing.
needs that are not counted. But
Right. And there are some exemptions. There are some waivers
Yes.
and some exemptions that come along with it for a short period of time. Not always, but essentially most people are adhering because this is the standard for most. Very few people know of the exemptions or things like that, or the waivers that might be able to be applied. Like if you're trying to get employed or something like that, and you can have a waiver for up to like 36 months or something like that. So a lot of people don't know those things per se, that would help with this asset limit. So most people adhere to the asset limit.
yeah. And what I don't understand is why some states have chosen to do that. I've been told that that's a federal requirement, but yet there are states that have gone past that. So there's a lot that has to be understood.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I can't imagine someone trying to qualify for Medicaid and need to move at the same time. You have to have more than $2,000 just to pay for security deposit and first month's rent, right?
Can I ask a clarifying
Go ahead.
question? So is the idea that the current asset limits are like preventing people from being able to like earn income from a job And that
That's-
income can help them get housed, but they can't get that job because of the asset limit? Is that how it's playing out?
And I
Okay.
think that's a huge fear from people who receive, any kind of disability payments like SSA or whatever. That's a fear like they can't work. But there are waivers, there are exceptions that will allow them to work for, again, we're talking, a couple of years that will, not have this be an impact to them because SSA wants them to be able to work, wants to actually wean them off of it, and so that they don't have these limits. But I think it's not widely talked about, all of the exceptions or the waivers, and so people don't necessarily know that. They just know that if I make, $2,001, now I'm now cut off from everything. My income is now limited now, and that cuts other services off. That might cut off their food benefits or something like that. And certainly it won't allow them to go and get a part-time job even to be able to afford housing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed and Lillian. That's really helpful. That helps me understand this one better. Thanks for bringing that to our attention, Ed. For the sake of time, I want to make sure that we move to public comment. So we're going to stop with our discussion today on the potential recommendations. What I'm going to do is have some discussion with the DSHA staff here about like how we want to get to the next step, making sure that we don't ignore any potential recommendations that folks on this committee have, and that we come out of our next meeting with some final recommendations for the task force. So in terms of process of how we get there, if you have not added anything to the Google Doc, you can still do that. But I don't want you to do that for any more than like maybe one more week. So maybe by the end of next week, if you just didn't get around to it, you've been on vacation. End of next week, I'm setting a deadline. So by Friday of next week, anything that you think is missing from what's here, please add it. And then we'll do some work in before our next meeting, which is December 17th, I believe, to make sure that we're in a good place at that meeting to really finalize some things. So thank you, everyone. And we'll send out these next steps by email as well. Caitlin, are we good to move on to public comment?
We are.
Okay.
We have no public attendees in the room, so I'm looking to our two folks online, Lizzie or Cheyenne. If either of you wants to give public comment, just raise your hand. It looks like we don't have any public comment. We will still accept written public comment within the next 48 hours. Comments can be emailed to housing.taskforce@delaware.gov. Any comments that are received within the next 48 hours will be appended to the meeting minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Caitlin. Before we adjourn, any final comments, questions, recommendations, next steps that folks from the committee want to share before we adjourn?
I think we still got a lot to. It feels like we had a great conversation today, but still so much to get through.
Yep.
I just want to give a shout out to our co-chair, Senator Huxtable. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Hi, Senator Huxtable.
He'll let us have all the before he tells them how hard it is to pass them.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm gonna therefore adjourn at 2:22 p.m.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.